Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Neurotech.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guests are Dr. Paul Tubig and Darcy McCusker, and we are going to be talking about neuroethics. So I'm thinking you guys both originated at University of Washington, but now Paul has moved to Georgia Southern University and has continued with the neuroethics over there. So welcome, guys. I'm excited to have a little bit of discussion about neuroethics. So thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting us to be on your show.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm going to start with a very general question. Why neuroethics? Why is it important?
Okay, wow. Thank you, Layden. What is ethics? So I guess one can say that in itself is a philosophical question, but the way that I understand ethics is basically the study of what is morally right and morally wrong. So we definitely encounter many complex ethical issues. And one of the concerns that ethics is concerned with is how do we figure out which actions or which practice is morally right and morally wrong? So that would be my very brief definition of what ethics is.
Okay, so neuroethics is involved with implantable or wearable technology, and you should see some of the YouTube comments I get. It's really all like conspiracy theories and, oh, I've been implanted and everything like this. Does that happen? And that's this dystopian matrix thinking or perception or something like this. But is that kind of what you are interested in or study, or what exactly is neuroethics, I guess?
So I think we're definitely interested in both the actual practice and how we can help researchers and designers make better technologies right now. I think we say this a lot, that we are interested in those future applications, those things that sound a little science fiction-y, because it is worth it to consider what the ethical issues are before the technology reaches that point. We're certainly opposed to unconsented to neural implants, but I also have a email folder of crackpot emails. They are sometimes quite hilarious. But yeah, I think it's worthwhile to have the conversations before the technology gets to that point. But yeah, something that's been a big theme of the projects that both Paul and I have worked on is about like helping researchers think more carefully about the ethical issues that are going into their research designs, that they're bringing to their research, and helping them try and think about if those are the values they want as part of their research programs. Any stakeholders that they haven't considered as part of their design process, if there are any possible unintended consequences of particular kinds of devices that they might want to consider in their design process.
Yeah, and it seems like your job is very similar to mine. You guys conduct a lot of interviews, both in terms of the implantees, people who have been implanted. Before the show, we were talking about you interview researchers and talk about your outreach. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? Are you guys just podcast hosts? Should I be scared about my position here?
I'll say no, Layden. You definitely should not be worried about your position as a podcast host. That is a position that I definitely cannot do. But maybe Darcy could. Hopefully, maybe she might start a podcast. But yeah, in many ways, one can say that what we do is quite similar to what a podcast host does. We definitely do interviews. But definitely one of the reasons why we do interviews, and many of the interviews that we do are with neural researchers, and two, with the actual and prospective users, is that if we're going to really grapple with the kinds of ethical issues we confront in the development of neurotechnologies, we definitely need to talk to the people who are not only creating these technologies, but those who are going to be impacted by them. So these kinds of the questions we cannot simply think about in the abstract, but we really need to talk with people who will be most affected by these technologies. So that's the most effective way to truly understand the ethical impacts of these technologies these researchers are developing.
And what are some of these ethical issues that are faced with neuroethics, neurotechnologies, that's not faced in normal day-to-day ethics? Trolley problem, for example.
Okay, I think that there are clearly, we have special beliefs about the brain, right? Most people tend to think if the brain is not equivalent to the mind, there's certainly some kind of strong connection to it. when you're online, you might have privacy concerns about your search data, but you're going to have even more concerns about your neural privacy if you have a deep brain stimulator that could potentially be able to read your thoughts and respond to them. Or if you have a device that needs to have some kind of connection to the internet or over Bluetooth, in order for it to be updated, you have to be concerned about who might be able to access your data, whether that's researchers or someone trying to hijack your data maliciously. So I think the categories are often pretty similar. Like privacy is a day-to-day concern for someone who's using the internet, but the level, maybe the sort of extremeness of the issue, I think is really amplified a lot of the time in neural devices because the data is so much more sensitive. Paul, do you want to maybe talk about some of the other kinds of categories?
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, so as Darcy pointed out, there are a variety of ethical issues that arise in the development and use of neurotechnologies. One is definitely in the broader social level that Darcy has pointed out. The kinds of neurotechnologies that are being developed, ones that can record the activity of the brain, raises very serious questions in regards to privacy and who can have access to such sensitive data. But there are definitely also ethical issues that arise in the individual level in the clinic or in the laboratory. One is the kinds of neural implants, such as neuromodulators, where you can alter brain activity. Definitely there are many worries, which seems quite unique to neurotechnologies, where the use of these technologies, though they are created to treat some kind of debilitating condition, may have adverse effects such as altering a person's personality or seriously altering a person's sense of self. There has been reports and testimonies of users who have experienced a sense of depersonalization, a sense of alienation, and a sense that they are no longer themselves. So that's one. And two, there's also serious concerns in regards to just the kinds of obligations researchers may have to those who do participate in these clinical trials. Given that these technologies are still quite novel and still quite new, there are still questions about after these research participants or after these clinical trials are done, what are the kinds of obligations researchers have towards these research participants? Given there isn't a kind of established infrastructure, does that mean that they have to explant the device? But should they explant the device if these users are gaining some kind of benefit with the device? What are the obligations in regards to providing ongoing care? So there are a variety of issues that do arise. Some are not as different from other ethical issues, as Darcy pointed out, but they are in some ways unique, just different types of privacy issues or social issues. But there are some other ethical issues that are quite unique to just neurotechnologies themselves.
Yeah, it really seems it's like almost coming to the core of your being, accessing your brain, accessing your volition, what you do, what you feel, your personality, as you guys had mentioned. Do you want to talk about this? You guys have done lots of implantee or neurotech users interviews. So what's the takeaways from some of these interviews?
I'll say that's a very good question. In a lot of ways, it is difficult to say that there is a shared theme throughout these interviews because many of the testimonies we do here are quite diverse. But many of the people we have interviewed, in many ways, have welcomed the development of such technologies. Many of the people who do participate in these clinical trials participate in them because they have some kind of condition that cannot be treated with the current kinds of treatment available. So they do in many ways welcome it. But then given that we are entering in a lot of newfound territory, many participants are quite concerned about some of the side effects that they do experience, such as an altered sense of self, that they might get treated differently because they have a kind of neural device and so forth. And also there's always a concern about how are they going to be treated after the clinical trial ends? Because even though they do enter the clinical trial knowing that that's just temporary, that the whole point of them participating in it is purely experimental. In many ways, many of these participants do turn to these devices as a way to try to improve their well-being where other therapies were ineffective.
Okay. And then how many people that are there that are affected by this kind of thing? Is it still a very rare thing? Can you count all these patients on one hand, or are there millions and we just don't know about it?
that's an empirical question. I think there are a decent number of these case studies. I think it's interesting to know whether we've asked enough people to be able to say that we definitely know how many there are. I think a lot of the themes that we've worked on at UW have come out of the conversations that especially Tim Brown, who was embedded with Howard Chiswick's lab, the biorobotics lab, working, directly with people when they were coming in for their adjustment sessions, for their DBSs. Tim, I think, asked a lot of these research participants questions that other labs maybe just aren't, for a lot of reasons. It's not that those labs aren't doing good, important work as well, but it turns out that when you have an ethicist in the room, I think you end up asking really different kinds of questions of your participants. So I think that the kinds of experiences that we've heard about and that we see in case studies, I think some of the reason those come about is because there's someone who's interested in those questions, who's willing to ask them. And because I think it is often harder for research participants of their own volition. You have to already have a pretty sophisticated understanding of yourself and your relation to your own mind to think, oh, this device makes me feel alienated. If someone asked you, do you ever feel that there's some kind of disconnect between what you intended to do while using the device and what your actions actually were? They might say, oh yeah, that has happened. Every once in a while, I'm trying, like in a patient with essential tremor for Parkinson's, I'm trying to grasp the fork more strongly and my arm jerks in a way I didn't expect. And they might not say the word alienation, but given the other conversations that we've had with end users, we might be able to see, oh, there are these instances where people have these unexpected and uncomfortable, generally, like feelings of the device doing something they weren't quite expecting. So I think it's hard to say. It is an empirical question, how many people are affected by these kinds of side effects. But it's not surprising. Most people do have side effects from most medical interventions of any kind. And when the medical intervention really is getting at this very, deep part of yourself, your brain, it seems more likely that we would see kind of unusual side effects like alienation, undermining sense of self, changing understandings of agency.
Interesting. So basically, you're there to ask better questions of the implantees in order to find these potential trends that even the implantees themselves might not recognize, and therefore see if we're on a good path as this technology improves, like it could become more and more powerful. So is that something that do you think it would happen as it becomes more powerful? Would there be a higher chance of alienation or doing something you don't expect? Or what do you see as a trend?
So at least from my perspective, one of the reasons why we do ask these questions is that we're trying to figure out what are some of possible adverse side effects that we're not at the moment recognizing in developing these neurotechnologies. If we do listen much more closely to the testimonies of end users, and much of their testimonies do involve these types of like negative experiences, feelings of alienation, self-estrangement, and so forth, then one of the goals that, that me and Darcy really strive to do in our own work is for researchers to be cognizant of these concerns as well. And maybe they can develop technologies in ways that might be able to somehow mitigate or remedy these adverse side effects. So in a lot of ways, in our conversations with neural researchers, though there are many other factors in play, many of the researchers that we talk to and know are quite committed to trying to be as responsive to the needs and interests of the end users. So if they know about these worries, then they may develop neurotechnologies in ways where maybe these kinds of effects are mitigated. But if not, then they might develop other types of practices, incorporating more therapeutic practices to lessen or reduce these kinds of negative effects that come from neurotechnologies.
Okay. So basically the improving of the technology is agnostic, but with more information, you could improve the effects on this, on the alienation and all this too. Okay, very interesting. Maybe let's do a little bit more personal question, and you can talk about your background a little bit. So why neuroethics? Why is it interesting to you? Why do you think it's important?
So I got involved with the neuroethics group thanks to Paul. In fact, he brought me in on the SPECS project, Scientific Perspective on Ethical Commitments Survey, and that was the tool that we brought to University of Florida a couple of years ago, where we were all there, but we got to talk about some of the ethical values that researchers at UF bring to their work. Paul and I got to have a really fun conversation with a bunch of the people there. We definitely really enjoyed our time. My dissertation is more strictly in philosophy of science. That's where I have a lot of my background, but I think doing applied ethics is really important. I think a lot of facets of our world don't do a good job engaging with ethical questions. And I think technology and science is a really important place to engage with researchers directly. And that's been one of the best things about working with the neuroethics group, is that we get to talk to people actually doing the work. Philosophers with an unfortunate level of frequency often aren't really engaging with anyone except themselves within philosophy. And I think that's pretty clearly not an effective way to change anything. It's not going to work to improve research practices. It's not going to help researchers to make better products. So I've really enjoyed getting to work in this space, just because I think it's let me take a lot of the things I learned from philosophy of science, but actually get to have an impact on something.
And that's a great question. I was introduced to neuroethics when I joined the philosophy department at the University of Washington. I did enter the department with the interest of studying medical ethics. I was particularly interested in healthcare justice. But when there was an opportunity to join Sarah Gehring's neuroethics thrust and be involved in her neuroethics group, it sounded like a really exciting opportunity, and I joined. But definitely when I joined the group, I encountered all of these really interesting questions that I never thought before. One, I wasn't even aware that they were developing these kinds of novel neurotechnologies where you can insert a neural implant and then it could modulate your brain activities in these very undesirable, but also in these very unsettling ways, which raises all of these really interesting ethical questions. Like, for example, the idea of developing a kind of implant where one can just alter their mood or alter their emotional state, or even though these devices are being developed for like therapeutic purposes, it does seem like the trend would then lead towards, when more is known and the technology is a lot more sophisticated and matured, then it would then be more commercialized, and maybe it might be introduced for enhancement purposes. And these questions are so fascinating to me, because in a lot of ways, the ideal of human life for many people is happiness and so forth. But the idea that that we can just implant a neural device and then just push a button and then have that euphoric state, that just raises a lot of really interesting ethical issues, whether or not these kinds of devices are desirable. And if they are desirable, whether they should just be limited to a certain kind of use, whether only for therapeutic purposes. If not for enhancement purposes, then what are the reasons for that? And also, if it does get used more broadly, then there is this concern about justice, where these devices may only be accessible to the affluent or those who can afford it, which may exacerbate existing social inequalities. So I'm really interested in the development of these new technologies, and how it's going to impact not only our understanding of what it means to be human, but its impact on broader society. Because in a lot of ways, the more I get into neuroethics, there are certain directions that are taken where I fully embrace that sounds great. But at the same time, it seems that it's also approaching in other directions that seem quite unsettling and troubling. And so the reason why I do neuroethics is it's just really fascinating, but not only really fascinating in the sense that it makes talking about these topics really, really fun, but also it has some serious ethical implications and impacts on concrete human lives. So also it feels quite urgent and quite pressing. And given that I'm always interested in social justice issues, this just seems like an underexplored ethical issue that I'm just really interested to investigate even.
That's funny, actually, when you mention that, you make neurotechnology sound a lot like drugs and alcohol, and that you basically have this like happiness lever. And so basically, couldn't we just transfer everything we know about the ethics of drugs and alcohol into neurotechnology?
There's definitely some strong similarities. I think right now, we're only using neural devices for interventions in mental illness, right? Like depression and OCD. But of course, we should think about what happens if we're going to start using them for emotional modulation in everybody. But at least for right now, we don't have to worry about that for like cost reasons, for the difficulty of implanting. But yeah, I think that there are definite strong similarities to what we know about how people should use drugs and alcohol. And I think there are important considerations that are distinct with neural devices, some that Paul already talked about too. But yeah, I hope I don't want a neural device that changes my mood. I don't think I want that.
Some people might not, but yeah. But anyway, or some people would disagree, but maybe that is going too far. And then you guys are part of a neuroethics roundtable project. What is this about? What is the goal? What has been some of the outcome? Maybe Paul can talk.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, so the Neuroethics Roundtable project is a project that Darcy and I developed while we were PhD candidates at the University of Washington as part of the neuroethics thrust at the Center for Neurotechnology. So the gist of the Neuroethics Roundtable project, we also call it, the acronym is SPECS, the SPECS project, which stands for Scientific Perspectives and Ethical Commitments Survey Project. So basically, we go around different neurotechnology centers to meet with and talk to neural researchers. And we have a kind of ethical discussion with these neural researchers about the kinds of pressing ethical issues that are related to their work. And so it involves a kind of exploration of their value assumptions, a kind of discussion of alternative perspectives, and trying to develop a shared awareness of the ethical complexities of the kind of work that they do. And basically, the goal is for researchers to be a lot more cognizant of some of these ethical issues, because oftentimes the worry is that these new technologies are often developed without any serious critical investigation of some of the presuppositions that might be motivating their work. For example, what exactly are the ends of these technologies? What are the kind of goals that we're trying to promote? And then having these kinds of discussions with neural researchers, they might be able to reveal that some of the ethical commitments that they currently hold isn't necessarily reflected in their current practice. So it gives them the opportunity to, say, revise their practice or revise the ends of their research so that it's a lot more reflective of their ethical commitments. And do you want to say a bit more about that, Darcy?
Sure. I think we do these workshops for an hour and a half, and the hope really is that it's going to spark conversations when people go back to their labs, and they'll bring it up at their next lab meeting, and it'll be an opportunity for the lab to say, oh, that is really interesting. Here are the ways we've already thought about it. Here are some of the things that we're already doing. Here are some things we might want to also do. So yeah, I do just want to say that, like, we think neural researchers are generally a very thoughtful bunch of people. And it's not that ethicists can come in and without us, no one will ever make good technologies or anything like that. But just that, yeah, I think the conversations are different when you have this sort of ethics focus, a commitment to ethics integration into your research process then.
I just wanted to follow really quickly on that. Yeah, as Darcy pointed out, like one of the points about the ethics roundtable is that it gives neural researchers the kind of space that they're often not given, and just to pause and just to think about some of their ethical values and some of their ethical beliefs, and whether those ethical values and beliefs are really reflected in the kind of work that they do. Oftentimes, researchers are always so busy and also caught up in their own work that the goal of these roundtables is just to just give them a break, just have them step back from their own research and have a broader reflection on their work as a whole in regards to whether or not they're fulfilling their own ethical commitments that they explicitly endorse.
Yeah, bring things into alignment and make people a little bit more cognizant about this as they're going their day to day. I think that's very important. So, yeah, those are really interesting topics. As we're finishing up, I think this has been interesting. It's very important to keep neuroethics top of mind or something that you're aware of as you're doing research, doing studies, all this kind of stuff. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you guys wanted to mention?
I guess since we haven't seen you since we came and did the specs workshop, do you think that it did start conversations in your lab, in any of the other labs at UF? I
think it might have been like what you were saying, the lab meeting after, something like that. But I don't know if longer term, over years or something like that. And then I'm doing this, and I talk to neuroethicists, and I'm a little bit more involved in this kind of stuff. And then another thing too is, it depends on who you talk to, of course. So if you talk to somebody for whom it resonates, that could change their life. And maybe that's a minority of people, maybe that's 10% or something like that. But for the rest, it could just be another thing that they integrate or implement into their lives. But yeah, for that 10%, it could be life-changing potentially too. So Darcy, Paul, thank you so much for coming on. I think this has been very interesting. And yeah, this has been good. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.